Hello, my name is Eric Ford, and this is part 4 of 6 talking about strategic control and corporate governance, and we're going to talk about behavioral control. And before we start, I do sort of take exception to the term behavioral control. There's some fairly heavy baggage with the word behavioral. If you know about Skinner and people who did work with pigeons and Pavlov's dogs, those sorts of behavioral control experiments, in particular the Milgram experiments, carry fairly negative connotations along with the expression behavioral control. I might call it strategic control, cultural development mechanisms, where you have strong cultures that help support your strategic initiatives. Nevertheless, we'll soldier on with behavioral control as it is. What is behavioral control focused on? Doing things right. Again, in one of the earlier lectures, I think it also talks about doing the right things, not just doing things right. But there's 3 key levers. And again, we have another one of these triumvirate pictures where we talk about culture, rewards, and boundaries, and setting them up in a fashion where they drive people toward the right objectives. Why is there an increased emphasis on culture in modern management or contemporary management? Well, the competitive environment is increasingly complex and unpredictable. I'm not sure that statement's true either, although it certainly is demanding and requires flexibility in order to succeed. That I do agree with. The second point, that implicit long-term contract between organizations and their employees has been eroded. This too is true. Take, for example, my own profession. In higher education, it used to be that college professors would join the state retirement system. It would often take us 2, 3, 5, even 10 years in order to what we call vest into the system. And to be fully vested in the system was often calculated by a fairly complex formula that we had a rule of 38, which meant 38 years of service plus some other, your years of service had to somehow sum up to 38, depending on how old you are when you started, etc. Or simply 20 or 25-year retirement rates, which were common in the military for many years. And there was an explicit long-term contract with respect to your benefits and what would occur there. And we've seen that has gone away. I'm now in something called TIA-CREF, and sometimes the state systems will have a vestment period, but it's typically only a year or two, and most academics work for more than a year at least. I rather like this slide. I think there's a subtle irony that they picture a cube farm when they start to talk about the organizational culture. Certainly if you read the Dilbert cartoons, you'll know that the cube farm has come under a fair amount of ridicule for what it implies in terms of how people are treated, how the workplace has evolved, etc. But what is culture? It's a system of shared values and belief that shape a company's people, organizational structures, and control systems to produce behavioral norms. Who are some of the people in our modern industry that we see holding their culture out? Well, one is Southwest. I mean, they actually feature it in commercials. You see them talking about and featuring actual employees in those commercials, talking about cutting through red tape. We want to talk about boundaries, for example, and some of the controls that they put on us as customers in terms of baggage, etc. So we see that organizational culture of Southwest very strongly exhibited both in their deed and in their commercials. It's an interesting thing to note. I think Southwest has the highest inter-organizational marriage level of any company in the United States, meaning more people marry other Southwest workers as a percentage than in most other places. So culture matters. And it sets implicit boundaries, unwritten standards of acceptable behavior. We talk about dress. When I was a kid growing up, we talked about IBM as having a very strong corporate culture. And what could you wear when you worked at IBM? Well, you could wear a blue suit, preferably purchased at Brooks Brothers, a white shirt buttoned down, and a red or blue tie, typically with a muted pattern. And notice that all of this revolves around men. So the dress codes mattered fairly strictly there. We've seen, of course, a relaxation of the dress code in our society in general. Ethical matters. How are ethics handled within the organization? Is it anything goes, or what else matters? Those are big cultural issues. And the way the organization conducts its business. How does it treat its customers and other people? Another bit of irony is that they've selected Wal-Mart as an example, and I'll keep it in because a lot of Wal-Mart's success has been attributed to its strong and pervasive culture of its company. I'm actually recording this on Memorial Day. They were very well known for hiring veterans, especially retired veterans, as greeters and those sorts of things. Sam Walton, who's been dead for several years now, would drive around going from store to store and sort of mystery shop his own stores. And they would retain most of the elements of that culture when it first started out, and they had a very rigorous promotion from within, an entrepreneurial system that drives startups. Why do I say this is somewhat ironic? Well, Wal-Mart has recently been sued by many of its employees, women in particular, saying that the culture, as well as the institutionalized promotion system, discriminated against them. And they're doing fairly well in the courts as I speak, so there's some fairly strong evidence that sort of supports their case that the culture may not have been as equitable to women as one might like. So how do we sustain an effective culture? Well, first you have to build it. In other words, it has to be cultivated, encouraged, fertilized, I'm not sure is the right word. If you know what fertilizer is primarily made up of, that's a little bit of a troubling sort of analogy. At any rate, it needs to be talked about openly. People need to know that you think it's important and worked upon. How do you maintain this? Most cultures have a strong storytelling element of it, a founding story that talks about how they overcame adversity, etc., those sorts of things. Rallies or pep talks by executive. I think you need to be very careful with these. They can be effective when they're well done. Otherwise, they become simply jaded, rote experiences where everybody's required to show up on Friday afternoon and listen to the organizational lead hold forth on the great things that they are doing rather than putting forward the success of the individuals and the needs of our customers. Motivating with rewards and incentives. And again, I want to emphasize that the word incentive here, if we think about this as carrots and sticks, rewards are the carrots, incentives are the sticks, meaning the downside to not succeeding or performing. These are powerful means of influencing organizations' culture. If you've ever worked at some place where you got paid on a piece rate or as a percentage system, one of the things we used to say when I was a kid growing up was I don't see the percentage in that. I don't know where we picked up such a jaded expression, but in other words, if it wasn't something in it for us where we were getting a cut of the take, we really didn't want to participate. I guess I had a rather entrepreneurial group of friends. It focuses on efforts on high priority tasks. Again, I'll talk about my profession. If the dean really wanted to influence where we published our papers, he or she would put a bounty on the top tier journals, and when you got a paper into a top tier journal, you'd be paid the bounty. And some organizations actually do that, where they pay for that sort of thing. It motivates individuals and collective tasks, so you can have incentive schemes and reward schemes that are set up to reward teams as well as individual units. We'll talk about the downside of that in just a moment. And they can be effective motivators and control mechanisms. If you ever see a pink Cadillac driving around town, that's often a Mary Kay Cosmetics tool. And what is that? That's a mark of success. And I'll tell you, when I see typically a woman climb out of her pink Mary Kay Cosmetics, I know that's somebody who's hardworking, able to sell to other people, able to manage other people who sell to other people and instill some of that skill. They're really quite remarkable people, and they're worth talking to. And it's a very outward reward that people covet and want to have. So what are some of the potential downsides? Well, you get subcultures. At Apple, and I promise not to talk about them, but I will, at their innovation unit, they flew the pirate flag over it while everybody else had to have the logo flying over their building. And guess what? They started to be treated differently and thought of differently. And at one point when Apple was in decline, that was viewed very negatively. And so you can't have these factions arise, and they'll actually work to cut one another. And that may reflect differences among functional areas, products, services, and divisions. So having a little competition within is a good thing, as long as it's managed effectively. Too much, where we start to tear ourselves apart, can be a negative. So what are some of the characteristics of effective reward and evaluation systems? Again, objective, meaning you can see it, feel it, smell it, touch it. Objectives, in other words, you can measure it. People manage to what they can measure. In other words, we manage to the metrics. People want to get rewarded. Rewards are clearly linked to performance. Performance measures are clear and highly visible. Feedback is prompt. I tell you, the annual review is not often enough. In other words, when somebody gets that paper in an A journal, that check needs to be in their hand the next day. The compensation system is perceived as being fair and equitable. And I would go one further. Meritorious. In other words, people who merit reward receive reward. If you don't work in a meritocracy, I'd find someplace else to work. And the structure is flexible. In other words, can the reward system evolve? People will start to lock in their rewards in false ways if you're not careful. Boundaries and constraints. So there's two parts to this. I would tell you, if you go into an organization that's relatively new, that building effective policies, and we used to call this business policy and strategy, to set boundaries is essential. If you get to a more mature organization, take for example UNCG or any other higher education, oftentimes you have to start tearing down some of those old rules that were designed for different systems and different times, or have proven untenable or simply don't matter. So you need to know when you're setting up boundaries and removing barriers as well. Knowing how to remove a barrier is often as challenging as setting one up. Much harder to get rid of existing rules than to build new ones. Again, need to be specific and measurable. Time horizons. In other words, if you don't do it in the next year or two, it doesn't matter. And they also need to be achievable. If people feel like you're just setting up rewards that nobody's going to actually get, that's demotivating. And more cube farms. Setting up boundaries and constraints. These are designed primarily to improve operational efficiency and effectiveness and avoid unethical conduct. I would tell you most rules are set up around this unethical conduct. Something happened once we didn't like, and so now we've made a rule around it or set up a boundary. At a place I used to work, one dean flew first class, which was not permitted in our system. We were state employees, and that was violating the state's code of ethics for state employees. And it caused quite a lot of trouble. With that said, it meant that every employee booking every flight had to go through the university's travel system. We had to bring our stubs back. And I would tell you it probably added $100 or more to the cost of every single ticket we purchased. What's that an example of? Well, that dean probably spent about $300,000 on fundraising, flying first class, and he raised several $1 million, by the way, so it was probably not money poorly spent. But and to offset that $300,000 in abuse, we set up a system that cost like $1 million a year to administer. I'm not sure that was a good system. So effective boundaries and constraints do what? Organizational control, alternative approaches. We've talked about cultures, rules, and rewards. Culture, often found in professional organizations. We've talked about higher education being one of those. Rules are standards and rewards. All right? Again, if you get away from boundaries to a culture that's got positive features, you don't need as many rules. You hire the right people, they don't need rules. Training, they don't need rules. Managers who provide good day-to-day guidance, you don't need rules. Reward systems, etc. Well, that wraps up part 4. I'll see you back in a minute.